The other thing that begins to take shape by the time of the Zhou dynasty, and one that we need to take a few minutes to talk about, is Chinese, I guess we'll call it religion. There's a fine line between what is a religion versus what is philosophy, so we're going to kind of interchange those two terms here. But outlooks on how one lives their life and why and what is appropriate behavior. The Chinese were basically polytheistic people, as you may have already gathered. After all, and when you're practicing divination, if you are trying to contact the gods, that would imply, obviously, that there are many of those gods, and indeed that is what they believed. There were several core religions or philosophies, though, that also began to form around that. The one that is perhaps the most influential and the most important is Confucianism. Confucius was a man, he was actually a teacher, he's not a religious figure, that lived probably in the 500s BCE, so during the Zhou dynasty. And Confucius talked about man's behavior, and that the central core of what he talked about was relationships. Confucius believed that man is, by nature, good. He was a believer in kind of the reverse golden rule. Don't do to others what you don't want done to you, was the way Confucius looked at it. He thought that people were good, and the key here was that people would find their proper place in society and create relationships with others. Reciprocity in those relationships was key. This idea of balance, you give, you get, and by doing this, you achieve harmony. And harmony was his goal in society. Society is nothing more, says Confucius, than a network of relationships. And you need to recognize the overriding important balance, yin-yang, if you will, the superior and the inferior. And it begins, of course, with honoring the elders and through them the ancestors. Confucius believed in this, but he took it one step further. The real model relationship in Confucian ideology is the family. Husband and wife, older brother, younger brother, and so on. That husband-wife relationship is important because it capitalizes on this idea of superior-inferior, and the result is a changing role for women. In Confucian ideology, women begin to be frowned on. They are seen as lesser and less important. The man runs things, the man has the rights, the women don't. And so there is a change in that sense of gender equity that the Shang might have participated in that begins to erode under Confucian ideology. The key relationship from the family, though, even more than husband-wife or older brother-younger brother, is father-son. And father-son is a relationship that carries through even to government. If you think about it, the head of the government is the father of his people. The emperor is the father to the people, but he is also considered the son of heaven. And so that dual nature is there. Everyone is a father and a son, and that is how government is and society is structured. That's the model. The other important thing, because people can be good, Confucius believed that when we're looking at leadership and governance, it's very different than the way the Romans looked at it. The Romans, if you remember, basically said you need good laws, and they became a society of laws. Good laws, said the Romans, lead to good leaders and good leadership. Confucius says that's really not true. It's almost exactly the opposite. That good people, good leaders, morally virtuous leaders, to use the Shia concept, will yield good governance and good laws. And so the key is to get the right people in government. And that becomes a critical concept over the next few centuries. Confucius was not really well accepted at his time. He died thinking he had been a failure because people didn't really agree with him or like him, but his influence grows over the centuries, and ultimately he becomes, one might argue, the most influential and important person in all of Chinese history. The second religion or philosophy that bears at least a brief discussion is Taoism, sometimes spelled with a T rather than a D, as you see it there. Taoism also arose around the 500s BCE, so at the same time as Confucius. And Taoism is a little bit more cosmic. It's a little bit more of a real religion than a philosophy like Confucianism. It really revolves around the concept of harmony, particularly harmony between heaven and earth. And the idea that there is a natural law and a natural order to things, and we need to to understand that. You basically go with the flow, if you will. The suggestion to people is that you need to learn. Knowledge is incomplete, so it is important for you to listen and to learn and to yield to achieve harmony and live a kind of a mellow life, if you will. And in the long run, you will achieve strength and efficiency by doing that. The model here might be a rock or a boulder in the middle of a river. The water doesn't try to destroy the rock. Rather, it just flows around the obstacle, the problem, and continues on its path and goes where it needs to go. Very non-confrontational and in the long run, much more successful and harmonious. And of course, if you think about it, in the long run, that rock will be eroded and worn down by the water, and so the water is more powerful and will win in the end, but it doesn't need a big confrontation and violence to do it. It will just do it quietly and slowly, and that's Taoism. That's the Tao right there. The idea of the dual nature of things and yin-yang being adopted into Tao in this idea of balance. Government is seen as very constraining in Taoist philosophy because government is based on incomplete knowledge, because man has incomplete knowledge. You don't want a lot of government. You want the government to limit its role and let nature rule and flow around it. And so you have this very mellow type of concept that comes out of Taoism. The third religion, I guess, that we need to address or think about briefly is called legalism. And legalism also comes out of this era around the 500s BCE, but it is diametrically opposed to Confucianism and Taoism. Confucianism and Taoism are reasonably compatible. One can believe in relationships and harmony among people like the Confucianists and can do it in a non-threatening, non-confrontational style like the Taoists. Legalists don't have anything like that. The legalists say that goodness, virtue, unimportant, doesn't matter. What matters is strength and power. That's the key. You do whatever works, and so they look at government as something that should be strong and controlling and centralized. They don't believe in go with the flow. They're not worried about harmony. They want dominance. And the result is the legalists have a much more limited influence in China. They actually only dominate in one dynasty that we'll talk about briefly in a minute, but one very short dynasty. Otherwise, they're not really the dominant force for the most part throughout Chinese history, but they're always there, yin and yang. They're always there as the counterbalance to Taoism and Confucianism. That concept of you've got to be effective and do what works is there and not lost. The last thing that we should talk about just for a second under the Zhou dynasty was the rise of an educated elite group of people. Around probably the 5th century BCE, so the 400s BCE, you began to get the emergence of professional administrators to help the Zhou run their government. And the people that did that were the educated elite, known as the Shure. Doesn't look like that, S-H-I, but that's the Shure.